Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk Housing. I'm your host, Sarah Goldvine. In today's episode, we'll explore the powerful connection between pets and their people living in the Downtown Eastside. For many in this community, pets are more than just animals. They are loyal companions, offering unconditional love and support in often challenging circumstances. We'll also talk about the findings of a 2-year pilot partnership between BC Housing and the BC SPCA, which has shed light on the unique experiences of pet owners in the Downtown Eastside and opportunities for customized pet-friendly housing policies. Joining me for the conversation today are Diane Waters, Outreach Specialist with the BC SPCA, and Mandy Isaacs, Assistant Manager at the Vancouver Community Animal Centre or Shelter. Also joining me is BC Housing's own Mita Naidu as co-host. Before we get underway, I'd like to acknowledge that we're recording today's session on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, who have been caretakers of these lands since time immemorial. We offer our gratitude to their peoples, past, present, and future. Also, in full transparency, we are recording today's episode in November of 2024, and so our conversation reflects the priorities of this time. Diane, Mandy, Mita, welcome to Let's Talk Housing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dan, I'd love if you could just set us off with a little bit of context here. What is this pilot program that the BC SPCA has, and why did it get started?
Yeah, absolutely. So the BC SPCA has recently concluded a 2-year pilot program in conjunction with the BC Housing organization in order to try and create pet-friendly, supportive housing spaces within BC Housing, spaces that are already set up and running. So essentially, this became a project after the 2021 decampment of the Strathcona Park area. So for background, in 2020, Strathcona Park in Vancouver had become a long-term transient center for a lot of folks that were unhoused. So we had quite a few tents and makeshift lean-tos and shelters kind of set up in this area. And unfortunately, due to the amount of people and the amount of pets in that area, the park became uninhabitable and unsafe for folks to live in. And so it became a goal with BC Housing in conjunction with the government to get folks out of the park and into safe spaces to house. So BC Housing really took off with that and was amazing. Except through the experience, unfortunately, one of the BC Housing staff members was bit by a dog in the park. And so that kind of led the BC Housing staff to kind of reach out to the BC SPCA to ask for pointers on how we could potentially avoid these things in the future. And so that conversation ended up turning into a 2-year pilot program where we developed resources and recommendations for BC Housing moving forward in pet guardianship.
I was here at that time. I remember how heated that was. 2 years is not a long time. And yet here we are with a lot that has been done that was not done, right? To just over 2 years ago. Like, this was pretty new. This approach, at least here in British Columbia. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've found so far?
Yeah, so the project's first year was fully geared towards understanding and basically conversation and relationship building with folks who are living in the BC Housing spaces and also staff members in BC Housing. So what we decided to do in the beginning, before we even started any of our research, was we had Camden Consulting, which is an Indigenous consulting firm, help us kind of navigate how we were going to approach this, considering that the Downtown Eastside population has a large number of First Peoples. And so we really wanted to make sure that we were gearing this in a way that was equitable, had diversity and inclusion involved in our planning. So we've spent the first 10% of our budget kind of engaging with Indigenous coordinators and folks that may be able to help us kind of put an Indigenous lens onto the work that we were doing. And so one of the main things that we learned in the starting process of this was that talking circles were a really great way to engage the community, especially our First Peoples. And when going into spaces where there are lots of vulnerable folks, it made a huge difference to be able to gather everyone together in a circle in a safe space and to chat about what the needs were, and then really go off of what people in the building were seeing and also what staff were seeing. So we started there doing surveys, on the ground interviews, talking circles, and then info sessions with residents where we would go into 11 selected BC housing sites and kind of connect with the staff and the residents there to see what their main concerns were. So that was our first year. And then the second year of the pilot was geared towards tackling some of those concerns, providing resources for those concerns, and trying to mitigate and create initiatives to kind of assist in leveling those concerns out or decreasing the amount of concerns that staff and residents had.
That's so interesting, Diane. You've made, as Sarah was pointing out, you've made such big leaps in these kinds of connections between human beings and their pets. Mandy, can you tell us a bit more about the relationship between pets and unhoused folks, especially in the Downtown Eastside? Something I've witnessed is this deep connection. And I think there is a tie to a very holistic idea of relationship and family and community, especially in the Downtown Eastside. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's no denying the connection between people and their animals. And it's no different than my relationship to my dog. I depend heavily on my animals at the end of a long, hard day. And sometimes it's what gets these people up and going and moving. And like Diane said, our goal is to work with them, to listen to them, and to help provide the resources for them so that they can keep their family together and intact. And so my role through the Community Animal Center is to help support and give them the resources that they need to be able to have safe pets and safe relationships with their animals at home.
What are some of the challenges you're coming across in that effort?
I think some of the challenges, I think people's perception of why they should have pets or if they should have pets is truly a big challenge that they have to overcome. I think a lot of people don't look at the big picture and see that these animals are what drives these people to get up every day, and it gives them a purpose in life. I think some of the challenges they come up against is accessibility to veterinary care, to spay-neuter resources. Sometimes when they're struggling, simple things like food and bedding and shelter for their animals are some things that they come up against. And the SPCA is here to try and help provide and mitigate that problem.
There's something really important about pets and their relationships to people's mental health, as you're pointing out, as you mentioned, the mental health benefits, but a sense of responsibility, improved quality of life, companionship, emotional support. When we think of all the benefits that animals provide their owners, we could keep going.
Yeah, when you take the judgment out of people owning animals and you can actually see the beautiful side of some of these marginalized communities and the relationships with the animals that they have, it's a person's problem. It's our problem to judge these people and think that they can't have these animals because they don't provide the same enrichment for their animals that we do. But when you take that judgment away from it and you actually see the beautiful relationship and the connection, and that these people will put their animals' needs before theirs most days, and for me to be able to support somebody who feels that passionately and who lives that strongly in a relationship with their animal, all I want to do is support it. And so that's what I'm here to do.
Tell us a success story.
There's so many that we see every day at our center. I always say to our team and to our volunteers, if somebody knocks on our door and asks for help, we never turn them away. We don't judge and we never turn them away, and we do our absolute best to try and help them with whatever situation they're in. But it doesn't take a lot to really feel that and to see that connection between people. I have my own dog. I take him to work sometimes and walk him home. And we walk by this one building where there's a number of residents that live and they have their pets, and we know them because they pop by sometimes to ask for things. And there's this one gentleman who has the loveliest dog, and they are just like two peas in a pod. They just live for each other. And I know him well from stopping by, and we just stopped to chat because our dogs really love each other. And I noticed he had a rope for a leash, just a rope, and it was starting to fray a little bit. And she was a bit of a puller. And I said, you need to come by the shelter and we'll get you, a new leash and stuff. And he had a sore leg, and he said it was hard for him to get there. And so I just did a switch right there on the street, right on the spot. I was like, you can take my dog's leash. I'll take yours. And that way you don't have to worry about the leash breaking or tethering and her getting loose, which would be the worst thing for him. You would think that I handed him $1 million check. He was so excited and just so overwhelmed and so grateful that I was able to give him a leash and just his dog could safely be secured. And I think that what we don't understand, a lot of people, is for me, if my dog's leash is starting to fray and become a danger, it's just one more thing on my list of errands to do that day. One more thing that I have to remember to go out and do and purchase a new leash for my dog so that, I'm not having the same issue. But for him, I changed his day and I made sure that he and his dog were safe and happy. So, it can be something as simple as just giving somebody a nice leash.
And just to follow up on that, what can we do? What can Sarah and I do as regular folk, privileged folk with power? How can we support programs like this?
I think talking about it is a big thing. I think a lot of people, another story I had is, I was at my daughter's soccer game 3 weeks ago. It was cold. It was rainy. I got out of the car thinking, I don't want to do this. It's so cold. I don't want to stand here for 2 hours. And, I walked into the washroom at the soccer field and there was a woman there who had spent the night probably in the washroom. She was drying her socks in the dryer. And I instantly thought, I had a word with myself, like, how dare I be so upset about having to stand here, and as we were chatting and I asked her how she was doing, this gigantic dog came walking out of one of the stalls of the washroom. And he was this gigantic, huge, beautiful pit bull. And I had a moment with him and chatted and told her he was lovely. And had they spent the night there? And she said they did. And I said, do you have a jacket for him in this weather? And do you have enough food? And she said, I don't. And I said, well, the shelter's really close. So I can give them a call and have them put some stuff aside for you so that you can swing by and pick it up so that you guys aren't cold tonight. And so I just had her go and pick up food and a jacket and a bed and things for her dog. And, I made her whole day and I had the team set it aside and she went and picked it up. But then to come outside and, listen to people be like, well, she's in the washroom and she shouldn't be there. And people shouldn't have pets if they can't take care of their pets and they don't have a home. And that is not a solution. Judging people for having pets and not having a home or not having the same resources that we have is not a solution. A solution is to help them so that they can have their pets, so that they can be warm and their pets can be fed and they can feel like they're taking care of their animals, because that's all she had that day was that dog. So it's our job to make sure that she can provide for that dog and continue, improving her quality of life by having a pet. So what we can do is we can stop the conversations that we have about them not having pets. We can do donation drives. If your kids are getting together for Christmas parties, instead of doing a potluck, do an SPCA donation drive. Reach out to your local centers, find out what specific things they need. Do they need cat treats? Do they need dog food? Do they need beds? Have the kids do a donation drives. Kids love to contribute and be a part of that. Have them come in for a tour and see the animals. So I think the best thing we can do is to not pass judgment and try and be a part of the solution instead of the problem.
So one thing that folks might not be aware of is that BC Housing, our staff have an annual giving campaign. And I'm raising it because we're recording this in November and we're actually midway. We're almost at the end of our annual giving campaign. And one of the priority charities that BC Housing staff identified is BC SPCA and Charlie's Pet Food Bank, which I think for new employees at BC Housing, they're like, And then once folks work here for a little while or work in community, it just makes sense, I think, for some of us who work with communities to really, we can see the connection, but maybe some of our listeners don't. So I'm wondering, Diane, can you help make the connection? Like, why is it so important for folks who are experiencing housing insecurity, for folks who are experiencing homelessness, or for folks who perhaps are now in stable housing, but who have had that experience in the past? What is the link between having a pet and housing? Why is that important?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think kind of to start off, the population in the Downtown Eastside, it's such a microcosm and it's so different than anywhere else that we see, especially like provincially for sure, but even nationally, it's tricky because we live in such a temperate climate compared to the rest of Canada. We do get a lot of transient people from other provinces coming out this way. Even the folks that are coming out from different provinces are people who have lived in BC their whole lives. The folks that are living in the Downtown Eastside often don't have a sense of community other than their Downtown Eastside brothers and sisters. A lot of them don't have family members or friends to support, or for whatever reason, they might be on their own. And so a lot of these folks, when they do get pets, have that sense of family and it's reconnected and they have companionship and they have love and they have care in their lives. And like Mandy was saying, the human animal bond is so incredible. It builds such a sense of accountability and responsibility. And we've seen this a number of times, even just working in the Downtown Eastside or working provincially with the Pet Food Bank program at the SPCA. It builds a sense of responsibility in clients and our service members to do better for themselves and to do better for their pets. For example, I spoke with a man probably 3 weeks ago at Charlie's Pet Food Bank who came by and he wanted to drop off a donation of money. And we're like, oh, are you sure? Like, that's really generous. You don't have to. We're here to just help support. And he said that in the past few years, he had been accessing the Pet Food Bank program and that it helped him get through a tough time with his cat. And now that him and his cat were able to find housing again, he was able to focus more on finding safe housing with BC Housing as opposed to worrying about where he and his cat are going to get the next meal. And so he was able to, instead of focusing on figuring out where to get food and how to feed his pet, he was able to focus on instead finding a safe space to live, figuring out ways to kind of get over his addiction. And since then, he's become way more stable in the environment. And so now that he's comfortable, he wanted to give back to the people that had been helping him and help others the way that we were able to help him. So with his donation, we were able to purchase more pet food for other cats that may need assistance. And so I think that, and this is like one of many stories we hear. I've heard of folks who have completely stopped using drugs and alcohol just because they feel like their pet deserves a more attentive owner. Or I've had people who are going through harm reduction approaches to try and wean themselves away from their addictions. But because they have an animal, they're like, oh, I don't want to use near my animal for XYZ reasons. So I find a safe place for my animal to go while I'm doing that. And it slowly starts building this accountability and this sense of pride in animal ownership. And I think that that's really, really good for folks who are living rough because it gives them purpose. And when you have purpose, there's a reason to move through life. And so I just think that it's really, really important that we're doing this work and that BC Housing is doing this work and that we continue looking at animal welfare and human welfare as a one health, one welfare approach, meaning that if we want to help animals, we need to help the people associated with animals, and we need to also help our environment. And so since they're all interconnected, we can't do one without the other. And so I think, like Mandy was saying, trying to have these conversations and removing bias and trying to understand that folks who have animals who may be unhoused or maybe living different than we are doesn't mean that they aren't deserving or good pet owners. I think it's just a matter of our thoughts and feelings towards differences. And if we can kind of eliminate that and instead encourage compassion and assistance, we'll see folks moving out of these hard, rough spaces and finding more sustainable ways of assisting themselves and their pets. And so I think it's a really important conversation to have.
I'm thinking of listeners that are owners of properties or owners of buildings. What do we say to them to help build this kind of reference when they are, dealing with dangerous pets, dangerous animals, other owners of private housing in which there are complaints? What would you say to them to help alleviate the stigma and the fear?
I think that the resistance that we're seeing comes from the negative stories we're seeing in the media. A lot of the time, media is focusing on the bad pit bull who bit a family-friendly dog at the dog park, and this pit bull was owned by XYZ person, right? And so we're really focusing on things that they're more negative, of course, and we're focusing on these sensationalized stories that don't happen as often as we think they do, especially when we're talking like breed specifics and in rental spaces. So lack of pet-friendly housing is a huge problem that we're seeing. It's increasing our levels of homelessness because people would rather choose homelessness than surrender their pet. And this is how strong a human-animal bond is. That attachment is so strong that people would rather live with their dog outside than give the dog up to be in a warm, safe environment. And so knowing that, I think it's really important that we work on government relations and chatting about more pet-friendly, accessible housing. Part of this is that there are ways to mitigate behaviors in animals that might be deemed negative. So, for example, a lot of people, when they see a dog in a muzzle, they think, oh, that's a bad dog. Whereas realistically, that's a wonderful pet owner. That person knows that maybe their dog's reactive. Maybe their dog doesn't like men. Maybe their dog is scared of children. Whatever it is, they know that there may be a risk of a nip or a jump. And so to kind of mitigate that risk, they do muzzle training with their dogs. And so that way they're keeping their dogs safe and they're keeping the public safe as well. And these are one of the things that you can do quite easily at home by yourself, just by reinforcement training with treats to help a dog get used to a muzzle, or keep your dogs on leash. These are all things that you can do to kind of mitigate any potential risk factors. And I think that the risk is so much higher, or it's lower than we think it is. Like the risk in the media has been inflated. So when you're looking at actual records of dog bites, it's not as common as we think. And if they are, these are things that can be mitigated before it happens. It's just about knowing the signs and potentially reaching out for assistance. So at the BC SPCA, we do have an animal kind training program, which is high welfare training, specialized trainers that deal with positive reinforcement only and are able to assist people who may need help mitigating behaviors in their dogs or training behaviors in their dogs. So that's a very helpful resource. And then we also have a ton of educational information online on our website and also within the BC SPCA as well. So if you're not able to find what you're looking for online, you're welcome to email us at any point and we can send you any kind of information to kind of help ease any of those nerves or transition periods with pet ownership and housing.
That's fantastic. I'd like to squeeze in one final question. As we look ahead, so the pilot project has wrapped up. Mandy, what would your hopes be for how BC Housing works with the SPCA or the province works with the SPCA in the years ahead?
I would like to get away from sheltering animals. And I think in order to do that, we have to have more pet-friendly housing. We have to have more access to subsidized veterinary care, spay-neuter clinics. Because what happens is if we're not providing those resources to communities, then our shelters are becoming overwhelmed with animals, right? Which is just another problem in itself. If an animal is not spayed or neutered, the shelters are dealing with the 6 to 12 kittens or puppies every year that are coming from that, when we can simply just spay or neuter the animal and assist people. So for me, more pet-friendly housing and more subsidized veterinary care is what I would like to see change.
Part of our our final report with BC Housing was offering a number of recommendations. And part of this was recommending that pet-friendly buildings or social assistance buildings where social housing is available, one of the recommendations is having kind of a subsidy per animal in the building. So the average expenditure on a pet per year for most people is about $1,100 in veterinary care. And so we do highly recommend that social housing spaces keep a little money aside for each pet in the building in case of emergency, in case they need to get vaccinated, in case they need to get spayed or neutered, to kind of help mitigate those problems, like Mandy was saying, the excessive litters that are coming into the shelters, to help with disease spread. So making sure animals have their first round of vaccinations to avoid spreading these diseases to other animals in the community. And I think also the big thing is we are hoping to lean away from sheltering animals, and not because we don't agree with sheltering and we don't want to shelter them, but realistically, animal welfare is they do better in a house, in a home environment. And so leaning more towards fostering and having animals stay with their families is a huge goal of the BC SPCA. And in 2025, we'll be rolling out a new strategic plan. We've put in a ton of effort and time into restructuring kind of our goals as an organization. And the executive leadership team have really transformed the way that we want to help animals and communities. So we will be looking at more outreach programs, more assistance in communities, and more work with vulnerable populations to ensure that we're proactively keeping animals safe, keeping animals fed, and keeping animals in good behavioral standing so that they don't have to come into shelters after all. They can stay with their families and stay in the communities where they're happiest. And so that's kind of what our organization is leaning towards, and hopefully will be effective in rolling out some pet-friendly housing policies with other organizations, and we'll see some changes.
Excited to see what comes. Diane and Mandy, thank you so much for joining us on Let's Talk Housing, and special thanks to Mita for helping co-host today. We'll talk again soon.